Today, on our Tech for Business podcast, we're joined by LastPass's very own Mike, Senior Intel Analyst, and Stephanie, their Cyber Threat Intel Analyst. So I said off the air, I'll say on the air. Thank you both for taking time to be here today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Absolutely happy to be here.
So I joked before we started that our listeners, they know LastPass. We have talked about it on many podcasts before, but we've talked about it in terms of a password manager. And I know that you two are doing so much more. You're doing so much more in the trenches and bringing awareness around security. So I kind of just want to start with who you are and what you do for LastPass. So maybe, Mike, we can start with, what does Intel Analyst mean?
Sure. Yeah. So we are on what's called our threat intelligence, mitigation, and escalation team. So our time team, because everything's got to have an acronym. So we focus on, if you think about a security team for a company, they are usually focused on sort of walls in. So let's make sure that the product is secure. We've blocked all the doors. We've, checked all the windows. Everything is safe. A threat intelligence team is really helpful for a company. Then we can look out, like walls out. What are the threats out there that are impacting us at our perimeter, that are impacting our competitors, that are impacting our sector? And then what do we need to do to be prepared to protect ourselves against those things proactively? Or if there's other, if there's stuff that's going on, concurrently, we can keep track of that and sort of pass that along to our security team to make real-time adjustments as necessary. So really, it is the difference between sort of walls in and walls out. And we are really sort of focused on standing at the perimeter and tracking what sort of threats may impact us or our customers before they have a chance to do that.
I love that. That's very concise. That was a great explanation. So, Stephanie, maybe you can share a little bit, what is really rewarding about this work that you're doing with LastPass, an Intel Analyst?
Yeah, I think being part of this organization that is really, at the end of the day, keeping individuals and companies secure, protecting information that is really valuable to them, and kind of having that kind of personal connection to our customers. And as a LastPass customer myself, like it is incredibly important, and we understand the information that we're keeping safe for our customers is essential.
What do you find really challenging in this field? I mean, I can only imagine a little bit of like the stress and the speed at which everything moves, but what do you find challenging?
Yeah, I think what's challenging, but also keeps this type of job really interesting, is that there is constantly new developments, new information coming out that, we do our best to stay on top of, and really trying to sift through the noise and identifying what's important, what are the key trends, what's the activity that we need to pass along to our partners to respond, and also keeping a finger on the pulse and recognizing when there is a change in a trend. We're seeing some concerning development starting to happen, and kind of trying to be, ahead of that before we're targeted or our customers are targeted, and keeping our customers and information safe. So that's always kind of the challenge of the job as well, because it's just this information kind of overload you'll hear a lot of people talk about, and being able to sift through that noise and getting a feel for what's important, what's not as important, and honing in on that.
Definitely. So speaking of, keeping your finger on the pulse, today we were going to talk about InfoStealers. And that name seems pretty obvious what it means, but Mike, maybe I'll throw it to you to just give us a quick kind of elevator explanation. What is that? And really, who is being targeted by these InfoStealers?
Yeah, sure. InfoStealers are, as the name would imply, it's a portmanteau for information stealers. So it's a malware that is focused on stealing information from a victim's device or machine. So, your computer, your phone, whatever it's impacting. What people often, I think, don't realize is the depth and breadth of the information that it's designed to steal, because it's really meant to take just about everything it can from the impacted device. It's a malware that's designed to be light and fast. So it's a small program. It'll impact people through a number of ways. It can either be, via the classic phishing emails. If somebody is looking for free software or maybe off the book software,
Mhm.
it'll often get distributed using sort of cracked software links or on YouTube in particular. So if people are looking for free versions or off the books record or versions, like I said. And then once it gets onto your device, like I said, it's meant to act very quickly and with a really low profile. So even if you have an antivirus or endpoint detection and response, it can still work very quickly. Spy Cloud actually had a really good stat from last year that I think they said 54% of the cases that they investigated for InfoStealer infections actually had AV and EDR on their devices. So even if you've got that level of protection on
Yeah.
there, this is still really effective at getting the job done. And once
Mhm.
it gets on there, it'll grab primarily focuses on browser-based credentials, and that can mean your passwords, obviously your username, any sort of other personal information, social security number, anything like that that's stored on your computer. They often target crypto details, so like logins or keys or anything like that, wallet information. But then the other thing that it'll grab, and this is really kind of the interesting subset of the data that it grabs, is just about all the information you can on your computer itself. So what kind of hardware does it have? What kind of software does it have? And that's so that these criminals can then sell that data so that either they themselves or whoever's buying this data can then impersonate you through your device, to include your device to then log on to access your accounts. So trying to get around other anti-fraud protections that are in place. So as far as who's being targeted, really, it's everybody.
Yeah.
It's individuals, it's companies, some of the biggest breaches of 2024 came back to InfoStealers. If you think about like Snowflake, if you think about Change Healthcare and the subsequent knock-on effects to United Healthcare, all those came back to simple InfoStealers. But then they're impacting, like I said, individuals too, because the banking information that's on there is valuable. There's just a ton of good information that can be monetized by these individuals through a number of different ways.
Wow. I mean, yeah, when you're talking about it, it really, my next question is always, are there specific industries that are really impacted or really targeted? But it sounds like everyone. Is there someone more at risk that you find? I can imagine like healthcare, finance, or is it truly just blanket everyone?
Yeah, so you do tend to find crypto. There's an intersection with crypto and crypto sort of adjacent companies quite a bit. Same thing with individuals. Healthcare, as you mentioned, absolutely. And because it goes to that personal data that's there, it's, once they sell those credentials too, or that initial access, that's when ransomware companies get involved or groups get involved and stuff like that. So, there really is a wide breadth of impacted sectors, but healthcare, to your point, financial, manufacturing is heavily targeted with this as well. Because any sort of operational disruption that this can lead to becomes, really important and can drive a lot of financial revenue for these ransomware groups in particular. Because what you'll see, and I should probably take a step back as I talk about that. So I'm bringing the ransomware groups into these because what we've seen in the cyber criminal ecosystem is a sort of specialization of labor. So these groups get really good at certain things and then they monetize those aspects. So when we talk about the info stealers and the malware that's sold there, these are a subsection sort of ecosystem that are called initial access brokers. So these are groups that really focus on getting the keys to the kingdom and then monetizing that either through, sometimes they'll go in themselves and get their foot in the door and take their actions. But really, where the money for them is selling these to other actors who then will sort of conduct their actions on objective, like ransomware groups or something like that. So it allows these info stealer gangs to then focus on getting their foot in the door and then selling that data for minimal risk to themselves.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, I mean, just to give folks kind of an idea of just how cheap it can be for an individual to purchase, data from these logs. Like the average going rate is only about $10 per log. And there are millions of logs that are available out there for sale at any given time on the dark web. We also see these being offered in various platforms like Telegram. Sometimes they're just even dumped for free because group has used the logs for whatever they wanted, and then they're just kind of wrecking havoc and just dumping them. Like, anyone who wants them, here they are. So, they're really easy to get a hold of and super, super cheap. And, going back to, who's at target, like who are the people being affected by these Stealer malwares? These logs include credentials and sensitive information from victims ranging from multinational corporations to small businesses to individual personal accounts. They're taken from a home computer. And threat actors are also betting on individuals, a lot of times, accessing maybe their corporate accounts
Mm,
from their personal devices.
sure.
And so kind of looking for that kind of entry into corporate systems as well. So, they're persistent in that they're going to continue to conduct this type of activity and continue. We're going to see a continued increase in Stealer malware because it is so effective and so easy, and the information that it can get is incredibly valuable.
And add to the education sector, that's one I forgot to mention, it heavily targeted because, you combine the fact with you've got, an endless number of endpoint users who are accessing these networks that has all this valuable data. You see it there quite a bit as well.
Definitely. So you touched a little bit very quickly on like how, but does the tactic change if they're targeting a business versus an individual? Or should we be watching for the same things whether we're at home or at work? Anyone can kind of share? Maybe Stephanie, you can start us off.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's pretty much the same. Victims are pushing out this malware via several methods that we see. Phishing emails continues to be super popular and effective.
Mhm.
Um, Individuals might visit an infected website, or this malware could be pushed out through fraudulent apps. Maybe there's an app that looks legitimate or like a very close copy of an actual application, but in fact, it's pushing out this malware when people download it. Also, accessing or trying to download the cracked software. If folks are trying to get around paying for
Mhm.
legitimate applications. So all these things are pretty common that we see, regardless of who's being popped. And then once a computer or network has been infected, this malware will run. So trying to just rapidly go in and identify and pull out all the critical information. And oftentimes it can be like, I mean, within seconds, it's there and it's gone, and you would have no idea that you've been infected by this. And they're pulling information from browsers, important folders, and then that information is passed on. We're also seeing a really interesting kind of trend in that they're going after. Mike mentioned a lot of valuable information, including the operating systems, browser, cookie sessions, things like that. And in order to try to be able to use that information, the quicker that these access brokers are dumping the information online and putting it into somebody else's hands for them to then use, we're seeing them try to do this really quickly so that they can exploit, for instance, like so cookie sessions that are still valid so that they can get in and use that quickly. So yeah, this is all happening like in very rapid time. We're also seeing more and more automation of tools, so that's only going to kind of add to this problem of this speed and stealth of these InfoSealer attacks.
Yeah, Mike, maybe you can kind of push in a little bit more about sort of how this is evolving, that automation, that AI, how is that changing these tactics that we're talking about?
Sure. Yeah, so there's a couple different aspects to that. When it comes to the phishing side, that's where we see a lot of the biggest changes when it comes to AI, because these phishing emails that are being used to deliver some of these, these links and these the infected files and that sort of thing, they're using AI to boost the believability really of these phishing emails. When you think back what it used to be like when we'd get warnings and training on phishing awareness, it was looked for poor grammar, or looked for bad spelling, stuff like that. Now AI, they're using that to sort of take that out of the equation because they can ask AI to generate this email, takes all that out. And so sort of the classic tells that people look for and have been really familiar with over the last 10 to 15 years, or even 20 years, 30 years, are starting to kind of fall by the wayside. So there's that aspect of it. And the other thing that we see too, just as far as the delivery mechanism as how things are changing, is they've targeted quite a bit over the last couple of years developers. So people using GitHub or GitLab, if they can get their foot in the door there, to basically do supply chain attacks and just drop
Sure.
malicious libraries, malicious packages into these libraries, and then infect companies that way. So, when we talk about the difference in individuals versus companies and how they're infected, that's one way they can do it too. There's been some really successful campaigns using GitHub to, like I said, poison those repositories and then get their foot in the door that way. The other really interesting thing with InfoStealers is there's so many of them out there, and it's a constantly evolving threat environment for a couple of reasons. One, because it's so effective. Like there's so much money out there to be made. So that people are constantly jumping into this market. It's not that hard to do because there's a lot of source code repositories that have been leaked. So there's a ton of open source data out there. So somebody, if they're smart enough and they've done this before, can just grab that source code, change it just enough to make it their own, and boom, now there's a new family out there competing with all these others. So, you've got somebody else jumping into this. And it really, so it just kind of keeps changing. And part of what drives that too is the sort of human aspect of some of these groups as well, because what drives a lot of these changes too is these groups will get in fights. Like internally, there'll be this, somebody will get somebody else mad. They'll split off. They'll take that source code, either leak it publicly, like I mentioned, or just take it and then create their own branch, basically off of that original family. And so it's just, there's constantly new versions, constantly changing threat landscape, and really just exponential growth over the last couple of years. And if you look at security research companies and really just about any company that put out a sort of state of the cyber threat environment in 2024, and even looking into 2025, InfoStealers are at the top of every single list because of that.
Yeah. I mean, we've joked on this podcast before, we need to have like little tinfoil hats and things because it's, everything get just wild and scary out there. I kind of want to bring it back to LastPass. We've talked about these info stealers and all of these things, and I really want to know, what is LastPass's role in this, either bringing awareness or staying at kind of the forefront and stopping it. So Stephanie, maybe you can kind of start us off. What is LastPass's role in this?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to, specifically what Mike and I and the time team are doing here at LastPass is really trying to, do a lot of outreach to, our customer base and beyond, and really communicating, these are very real threats that can affect anybody, companies, big or small, individuals, it doesn't matter. We all face some sort of risk just by the merits of being online, right? We know that. And so, really, sharing the information, expanding our threat intel monitoring and alerting, our customers, our clients, and then just the broader, broader audiences, and trying to, sound the alarm so that people do take these threats seriously and, hopefully take actions to really protect themselves. And we're also really, involved in communicating with, folks in the industry. And so that, us as a collective in the collective password manager space can be aware of these trends so that we're not just protecting ourselves, but also, also more broadly. And I think one of our favorite sayings on the team is that a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do here, is just making folks more secure everywhere by giving them, the information and tools that they need to take action to secure their accounts and just be safer online.
Yeah. And I if we think about it sort of proactively and then defensively too. So, Steph covered a lot of the proactive stuff, the information sharing. We spend a lot of time monitoring what the activity is looking like in deep and dark web forums, who's advertising these credential stealers or these info stealers that are particularly targeting, well, not targeting, but I mean, they're targeting everything within a browser oftentimes, but if they're impacting our customers, that's what we're monitoring. So we want to track that sort of activity, so that we can, as Steph mentioned, we can raise awareness about it. We can share it with our counterparts at other companies and organizations. But then there's the defensive side of it too. So, part of what we offer is dark web monitoring. And that's, if your credentials get out, you may not even know it. As Steph mentioned, like, that stuff runs on your computer really fast. And then they push that data out really quickly as well. And most people, unless you have some sort of dark web monitoring setup, would have no idea about that. So that's part of what we offer as well, is to help with that. And, if we think about the Snowflake case from last year, that's really instructive of the concerns there, because a lot of those companies that were impacted, their credentials had been exposed for months, if not years, and they weren't aware because that monitoring wasn't in place. So that sort of defensive side, you kind of almost have to assume breach. So you have that extra layer of protection. And that really helps with that as well.
I love it. I kind of love the, all ships rise sense. That sense of community is becoming more prevalent in this cybersecurity space. The silos that used to exist are really disappearing. Can you maybe explain a little bit more of how a company can improve their policies and improve their culture around cybersecurity? That is such a broad question, but it's, the people are really at the heart of it. So how do you build a good cybersecurity culture? Think about it for a moment.
Yeah, so it's funny. So my background, my first half of my career was in the federal government in the intelligence community, and moving into the private sector, I was already amazed at, sadly, how much easier it is, and how much more collegial the environment is across companies and competitors for information sharing, especially when it comes to cybersecurity stuff. There is, to your point, this general sense that, hey, if we hide this stuff, the only group that benefits from that are the threat actors. If we don't talk about what we're seeing, that only helps them. So my background was in counterterrorism, and General McChrystal used to always have this phrase, it takes a network to defeat a network, which was very big in the counterterrorism community. And I think it very much applies here too, and informs a lot of the way we do things because of that. As far as building the culture, when Hoff, who's our chief secure technology officer, came in, that was really part of his focus as well, was building a culture where we can share information within the company, but also outside the company too. So, we've got, we talked about building a culture. We've got a security Slack channel that every single person in the company is on, and they can drop questions in there at any time. And all of us are on there, and it may be Hoff that answers it. And it could be somebody who just started 2 days ago who asked that question, and they've got the CSTO in a totally non-judgmental way answering that question, because ask the question, we'll answer it, and it makes everybody more secure. That, you kind of have to take the ego out of it, and that's really important. So being, and being willing to share your mistakes. Hey, I think I did something wrong. And people are willing to do that too. You got to make them feel safe to do that. And then that's on the internal side. And there's a lot more that goes with that too, just the education side of a company. Like, here's what we're seeing. We've had a lot of success with that. Actually, gosh, I guess it was just about a year ago, we had an instance where one of our sales folks got a deep fake call impersonating our CEO, like an audio deep fake call.
Wow.
But he was aware of the potential issue, raised it immediately in a very public place, so everybody was aware what was going on, and we could take the right steps, and everything went well. And that's because of that culture, I think. But then also, to the point about the rising tide lifts all ships in a sector and community level as well. I've worked at other places where we wouldn't have done anything with that. Like, we would have been proud of ourselves internally. But in this instance, you build the right relationships with legal, you build the right relationships with marketing and sales and everybody, so that you can share that information as broadly as you can. So it does benefit everybody. And in that instance, it was, hey, can we write a blog post on this? And everybody's answer was immediately, yes, let's get that word out there. And so it just takes a little bit of time, and it takes that sort of, there's an inherent risk in it, because oftentimes I think, especially in the private sector and outside of security, there's a sense of, well, we don't want to share anything because it can be dangerous and it can potentially look bad. But, I think especially when it comes to these threat actors and their activities, transparency is the best, light is the best disinfectant when it comes to their activities.
That's beautiful. It feels like such a great place to wrap up. Thank you both so much for being here today. And we always say a conversation is free. So if you want to get in contact with either of these people or with LastPass, definitely reach out to us and we can make those connections. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much again, Ariel. This was awesome. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.